Okay, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here present at the Supersalone, and everyone else we don't physically see, but I guess we feel your presence through the ether. We're delighted to be here on stage today with Beatriz Colomina, Aric Chen, and we should have Anthony Dunne in direct connection from, if I understand well, New York. Let's see if he shows up somewhere. Oh, there we are. Hello, Anthony. Did I get it right that you are in New York?
Yes, that's right.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much for having me virtually.
It's lovely to see you as well. I have to admit, it's for me the first talk which is going global in this way. I mean, we're all used to Zoom talks which go through the different time zones, but do it publicly, it's quite astonishing. I'm sure that the three of you are perfectly used to it. I would love to also, just quickly before we start, invite everyone just jump into the conversation, even if we're doing it throughout the globe, if we manage to keep it a conversation as interruptively and with full of questions to each other, the better it would be. As a quick introduction, before I go to all the three of you, let me say a few words of why we're actually here together. So the question is, who can say no to education? I think the title just came out naturally to us because we have an enormous exhibition about graduate projects on show. Now, Anthony, you unfortunately haven't seen it. You maybe got some information online provided also by us to go through. But to give you a bit of backstory to the Lost Graduation show is when Stefano Boeri invited me to be part of the curatorial team of the Supersalone, basically I got a sort of carte blanche, knowing that we most probably are going to do something about education and graduate students. So then now at retrospective, of course, it's always easy to say it was obvious what to do. We needed to do the Lost Graduation show as we have lost out for the last 2 years to see what the new generation is doing in design. It was based on an open call, got an enormous amount of proposals, more than 400 projects were proposed to us. We decided not to focus on the best of the best of the best of the best and become kind of maniac about doing the selection. We wanted to create, which we did, a broad stage for as many students to be able to participate from the most different areas and parts of the world as well. One keyword maybe for you guests to keep in mind that might come up later on is can we still speak about national design? Can we speak about Italian design? Can we speak about Scandinavian, Dutch design? Aric, be lovely to hear your international viewpoint on Dutch design as well. So what does it mean to bring globally young designers on one stage, and what you feel are the challenges they are facing, but also what can they do globally? Because one of the things that I would like to move to Beatriz right away is the question of can local schools address universal topics? Or do we need to change maybe the format of education as well in order to allow to research out of the box of the school? Before I let Beatriz answer, just a quick brief that everyone who might not be familiar with Beatriz's work, which I greatly doubt, but Beatriz Colomina is one of the most renowned architectural historians and theorists. She is the founding director of the Interdisciplinary Media and Modernity program at Princeton University, professor and director of graduate studies in the School of Architecture, and I'm sure you have plenty of more titles, which I probably forgot. I would just want to mention 2 books of her writing which have been a delight. Even though they're of slightly older date, they're still perfectly up to date to today. There's Domesticity at War, or Privacy and Publicity, or even Sexuality in Space, which have become legendary books, I think, in all of our education at some point as well. So, Beatriz, to you the question, are schools still adequate?
Are schools still
adequate for education, or do we need to think out of the box?
I think not. I mean, I think that's precisely the provocation that led to the research I did with my students at Princeton on radical pedagogies, going back to the 1960s and 70s, to the last time that there was real innovation in the teaching, in pedagogical approaches to education, coming actually bottom up from the protest of the students. And Milan, in that sense, was really remarkable. Think about that amazing picture of the student protesting the Triennale de Milano, making a circle around Giancarlo De Carlo, this extraordinary famous picture. I should have brought it in case you haven't seen it. And they are actually, in a way, it's a very complicated story because they are protesting, and Giancarlo De Carlo is there. He's the curator of the Triennale. He's all dressed up with his suit and his tie. He looks like the straight guy, but actually Giancarlo De Carlo was an anarchist. And in many ways, the students were following his lead in protesting the Triennale. So it's a complicated story, but where it is a historical research going back to the 60s and 70s, to the last time there was absolute great innovation in the field of education, and everything we are doing now in a way is following on these steps. It had an intention about thinking about the present. That is, it was a provocation to all the schools to see why have we not, in a moment in which everything has changed, produced innovation in the way that it was in this moment. And of course now, all of this is happening, all this discussion and your exhibition, which, by the way, I think is very good, and I want to congratulate you in the exhibition, and also the idea of this Triennale, the different format. I'm completely positive about this innovation in the design, and also the idea of bringing the schools to the presentation. And one of the things that I noticed in your statement about the exhibition, the lost graduating, so you talk about disruption, teaching disruption, and then I have this question for you: can we really teach disruption? And hasn't the pandemic itself been a huge disruption? And therefore, can we then think of the pandemic as a teacher? And I have two ways into this question that I put for myself on the provocation of Anina. And one of them is my research, my latest research actually is on illnesses and architecture. Believe it or not, precedes the pandemic. I was teaching about architecture in the age of pandemics before COVID, when COVID happened. So I'm teaching with the PhD students complex, I will say, not complicated, collaborative research project that will end up being an exhibition in Brussels and in other places and in a series of publications. Right? And the point that I want to make for you, which is the point that started this teaching, is that illnesses have always been a great teacher for design and for architecture, maybe the teacher of architecture, that architecture and illnesses have always been intertwined. In fact, every illness, you can argue, has an architecture, and every architecture has an illness. Designers, whether of a chair or house or a city, have for a long time, for centuries, imagined themselves as doctors. Vitruvius, for example, the so-called founder of Western architectural theory, already argued that architects should also study medicine, right? Because healthfulness, it was the most important objective of designers. So every medical crisis, you can argue, induces changes in architecture, urban design, and design of objects. The built environment, you can say, is literally shaped by the size. The history of the cities is the history of the seas. We can do a very interesting history of all the things that we have and we take for granted, like the clean water or the sewage. It's all coming from the pandemic. So we could completely rewrite the history of cities. In this sense, the pandemic we are still in the middle of has been a great teacher, in my view. I think this has been a great time for education. This is my point. But we will probably know exactly what the lessons of this pandemic are for some decades, in the same way that only very recently, and I'm referring to my own research on the impact of tuberculosis on modern architecture in my last book, X-ray Architecture. So only now we start to understand what tuberculosis did for modern architecture, right? Let alone what the 1918 flu epidemic did for architecture. Can we now think about this sink in the entrance of Villa Savoye and not think, of course, you have to wash your hands before coming into the house, whether you are a visitor or you are coming from the outside to your own. So many changes in architecture came from tuberculosis and from the 1918 flu. I said there are two ways into this question, and the other two ways is the one that Anina had asked me to talk about, which is radical pedagogies. Radical pedagogies is also a collaborative project that I did with my students starting in 2000, it's 10 years now, 2010 more or less. So it's massive research on the radical experiments that took place in the 1960s and 70s worldwide. Don't you think that it's just Paris and Milano and Barcelona, but worldwide, right? In fact, the exhibition became installation in the Arsenale during the Biennale of Venice of Rem Koolhaas. What was that, 2014? And then went to the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, etc. And now we are coming up with a big fact book, a kind of an encyclopedia of all the cases that we have collected over the years, 116 cases, 116 contributors. So it's not just the students of Princeton, but it became like a crowdsourcing thing in which, through the website, people will contribute case studies in South Africa, in many places in Latin America, in Asia, in New Zealand, in Australia, etc. 116 cases, and a kind of crowdsourcing things. And I think radical pedagogy is precisely all about disruption, inverting the hierarchies between teachers and students, destabilizing methods, locations, agents, representation. Everything was up for experimentation in this moment. And these experiments were, by the way, always short-lived, or very often very short-lived, because, of course, disruption can never be the norm. Each disruption needs to be disrupted. Otherwise, it's not disruption anymore, right? It has been institutionalized. Learning, in that sense, is always fragile. It happens somehow in the gaps between students and teachers. We think we are teaching. We are not. It happens in the gaps between what we are teaching. Most students learn more from their colleagues, from their companions. It's not necessarily a controllable or control situation. So in that sense, we might not be able to see in this exhibition, in this beautiful exhibition, what is most disruptive. I think what is great about such an exhibition is simply to document what happened during a time of disruption. That is, during a time when teachers were precisely away from the schools. We were not there. We were away. And the students were also away, right? And everybody had to occupy different spaces, physical and mediatic. And what happened, right? And I think this is what is important. And by the way, the idea of without graduation is almost the perfect summary of the ambitions of radical pedagogy, right? Because I was famous, for example, in places like the Architectural Association, which is one of the case studies of radical pedagogies in the 60s and 70s, that graduating students were considered losers, right? So you were not wanted to graduate. That I came up in many, many interviews with a lot of people that were part of this radical movement. To graduate, they say, was to fail, because who will want to be somehow approved by your institution in that moment in which goes all against the institution, right? So I hope this exhibition is not a new kind of institution, but a new kind of stock taking in the sense of Banhan, of what has happened in this particular moment in history. And I actually went to the exhibition and studied quite in detail, and I want to point to a couple of things that really interest me. Okay. Do you want me to do this now or later?
Please go for it.
Okay, so one of the things I noticed, and I say, well, we will not be able to evaluate, but I could not stop myself by seeing already how many of the entries have some medical topic in them. And I thought, this is remarkable. I could count many such cases, from the robust nest of Fabian Roy, which is this incubator for new born babies for sub-Saharan countries, that is compact, is robust, is affordable, it can resist multiple power cuts, can be transported, etc. Then there is Coco by Nicole Magagnotti, which is wearable toys for children with sensory needs, sensory integration disorders and autism. So it's again a design that is therapeutic and pedagogic. Then there is Tingle by Rodrigo Vera, a therapeutic device for children with hypertonia and hypotonia, conditions that affect mobility, and tingles and how stimulus the nervous and muscular. So again, great innovation in fields of medicine. And I don't think that that's an accident, right? All of this is happening in the context of COVID. All of a sudden, young designers are thinking about health. Think about Cap Smart by Paola Aldana, which is a vest that allows for the continuous peritoneal dialysis, which is the most common treatment for kidney disease. And the patients can be doing the treatment while continuing with their daily life. Or thinking about Helix by Daniel Lopez, which is a collapsible single material vaccination syringe, or the Imprimé by Mathilde Lafayette, which is a research project on the future of personalized medicine, the possibility of 3D printing medicine, and so on and so on. Lua by Ana Paola Campos from Monterrey, a product to reduce menstrual pain and using localized heat and pressure, and Oyo, which is by Alice Nardi, and Oyo means hug in Japanese. And it's actually, again for preschool children with autism, to allow them to release stress. And Loop, which is Loop Can, which is a cleaning kit for washing reusable menstrual pads designed for refugees. Or Hempo, which is a device designed to help midwife control postpartum hemorrhage. And Shui by Sui Ji, which is an instrument that translates visual information into auditory signals and can be used by blind people and by sighted people. So it's all about inclusion, right? And Compact C, which is a collapsible crutch. And then there is the beautiful recyclable gown for the medics, and Eva, which is a product designed to identify the onset of maternal peritoneal depression, and so on and so on. And I keep seeing the exhibition and I say, do schools of design always have so much design that has to do with the medical? And I have to ask you this question, because of course I teach in a school of architecture, not in a school of design. Is this normal?
Aric, what do you think? No? Anthony? Would you say it's normal that the medical field is so present? It has happened to be in our exhibition.
I don't know. I think.
I mean, you heard the list of Beatriz now, so it went on and on and on, right?
It is.
I could go on and on.
I think it depends, on the type of design course. I know the ones that lean a little bit more towards technology and engineering, for example. The ones I'm aware of have always had a strong interest in medical projects, but it does seem like it's spreading everywhere now, which is very interesting.
It does. What is lovely maybe in Beatriz's comment is first take a pandemic as a positive trigger for positive change. So disruption is positive, but then also what you're hinting at, take the future in your own hands. Don't wait, in this case, for the design industry to, welcome you and get your debut dance ready and so on. But, take the stillness of the world and start working for yourself, and then hoping to reach others as well. So there's a lot of good energy, which, of course, I hope also transmits in this exhibition. You, in our earlier talk, said also that it does not mean that the student himself or herself is a guinea pig of experimentation and research when you develop a product, but it's a lot about empowering as well. Would you like to say a few words about this idea of empowering graduates and students for the future profession?
Yes, I mean, I think that's the best thing that you can do with as a teacher. I mean, that the best thing that I think the best thing that you can do in an exhibition such as the one that you have organized is to empower the students, to give them a platform in which you can develop. So I suppose this is what I do with these collaborative projects myself with the students, in which I kind of launch them into some sort of research, but also offer them a platform for their writing, for their design, for their work to be exhibited to the public. I think here, I think it's very interesting that we are returning to be conscious of medicine as one of the areas in which the designer is involved. And I think it has taken an epidemic for us to be aware of this. And I'm not saying that the exhibition has only this, because of course the exhibition is also concerned with sustainability, with new materials, with this biological, is fantastic in that sense as well. And it's also taking the future in your hands, thinking about what is happening to our planet and taking a position. And it's really refreshing to see students doing this. But I will say that this is very good. But it was more like I was expecting this, because even the exhibition itself, the whole triennale, is based on this premise, right, of sustainability. The surprise for me was the impact of the medical, and I thought, oh my God, maybe it's because I'm obsessed with this question, right? But it's the last time that architects and designers were collaborated with doctors, as far as I can see, or as far as I know historically, is precisely that generation of the modern movement, right, in which for the treatment of tuberculosis, there was a very strong collaboration with avant-garde doctors and avant-garde designers in the design of all these great sanatoriums that became the basis of what we know as modern architecture. Modern architecture, believe it or not, wide walls and open windows and terraces for the sun and the cure, it all comes from the cure of tuberculosis. It comes from an obsession. I mean, if we think that COVID is bad, at the time that modern architecture was being developed, 1 in 7 globally was dying of tuberculosis. In the United States, it was 1 in 5, and in cities like Paris, it was 1 in 3. So the scale of that calamity was of a completely different order than the one that we are witnessing now. And I'm not saying it's not terrible, but this is closer to the 1918 flu in terms of so it's the last time, and in the meantime a lot of things have changed, because in fact we created the problem. I mean, with all this idea of going against bacteria, cleaning everything, white walls, etc. And then now we have the mega bacteria that is killing us, and the new research into the microbiome, etc. Great time for designers and architects to be involved with medical research, because a new architecture has to come out of this situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, Aric, as you saw the exhibition as well, did you have this sensation of nowness? Or let's say, of course, often it can happen that you go into an exhibition and you marvel of something which is, let's say, outdated the moment it's shown, because it closes a chapter. I would hope that the exhibition is perceived almost more like, right now it's a bubble, but maybe it's a trigger in some way, that these are projects which then continue in one way or the other. Walking through the exhibition, did you see, I'm sure you also saw the medical strong part of it. What else did you perceive as kind of keywords or examples that you think illustrate now? And what are the topics the students are universally discussing?
Sure. I mean, I noticed the preponderance of medical projects as well, and of course biomaterials and so on, which made sense. But I guess one project that stood out for me was, I think it was called the Micromort, and I have not taken the good notes that that Beatriz has. But I think that is a kind of a speculative project that tries to assign value to death through a kind of artificial stock market. And that was really fascinating to me, because, of course, at the moment when governments are trying to determine COVID-related policies in ways that sort of balance risk with protection, of course, the number of deaths and illness that one is willing to accept becomes part of the equation. And I suppose, in some ways, it's not so different from the way insurance companies have always assigned value to life. But now to kind of invert that, to see how we can algorithmically assign value to death somehow stood out to me. But I wanted to kind of just quickly build a little bit on your first question, Nina, partly in response to what Beatriz said, and I would really love to hear what Tony has to say. And you began by asking, is design education adequate? I guess adequate for the quote-unquote real world, right? And I would actually turn that question around and ask whether the real world is adequate for the possibilities of design education. Because I think as we've all become more and more aware, or has become more increasingly clear, the sort of systems and structures that we have been operating under are no longer functioning the way that we would like them to. And so the question then is, how do we rethink that? And you see a lot of that rethinking going on in design schools, or at least some of them, let's say. And so the question then is, what not so much what can the design education learn from the real world, but what can the real world learn from design education, and are we prepared as societies to begin sort of adopting some of these more radical pedagogies, but in practice? And I guess you wanted to ask me, Nina, about sort of the institutional role here being...
yeah, shall I do my question?
Should I just go ahead?
You go ahead.
Yeah. I recently started as the general and artistic director of Het Nieuw Institute in Rotterdam, and we have an amazing collection and archive, but also over the past 8 years of the Institute's existence, I think it's done an amazing job, to my predecessor's credit, of building sort of a very strong research ethos that extends into the speculative realm, but even speculating about not just the future, but also the past and the present. I think the question now is, and Tony, this is where I want to get your response, is at this point, like, what is the role of speculation really when we are more and more, when it seems, again, clearer and clearer that we are running out of time to just be speculating. Now, of course, speculation is still is really still quite useful, but in that case, could the role of the institution be to sort of operate at the threshold between speculation and practice, where we become a sort of laboratory for enacted speculations, where we're allowed to sort of test these different scenarios and possibilities, knowing that we're not finding this solution or finding any right answer where there is perhaps no right answer, but rather can we put into practice or enact different scenarios in trying out a multiplicity of approaches. And maybe that is increasingly the role of a cultural institution, because we can do that. We can sort of try things out without perhaps fear of failure. We can kind of continuously refine and test new approaches and see what we can learn from them, and perhaps what others can learn from them as well.
Anthony, do you want to pick up right from here? While we're waiting for you to come onto screen, maybe I just give a quick reminder to everyone who is here, who is Aric Chen. Aric Chen is you just moved from Shanghai to Rotterdam. One week ago. So you're still on the move, pit stopping here and there. But Aric is an architecture and design curator whose name you have probably seen popping up in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, in Miami, where he's also the art director of the Design Miami events, or the fair, and being now the appointed director of the Het Nieuw Institute. Is that the right way to say it?
Or just the New Institute.
Okay. He's also was a professor in Shanghai at the Tongji University. So it's very curious to see how Aric is kind of touching all the points that we're discussing, right? It's bringing university, it's bringing institution, it's bringing museum, it's bringing commercial design fairs onto one platform and then discussing about education. It's wonderful to have you here. But now I move the ball to Anthony. What do you want to say about where we're at with speculation, and is the world prepared for the speculation coming ahead?
Okay, that was going to be the conclusion of my mini presentation. Shall I jump straight to it? I think that there's big differences between speculating inside academia and outside. And I agree with Aric that maybe outside the time of speculation is past and we need to be acting and kind of bringing about change rather urgently. But I think within the academic environment where there's much intellectual and imaginative capital and less financial and technological means of implementing ideas, speculation still provides a kind of a lively intellectual and creative environment for disengaging with the many problems existing reality has. In a sense, existing reality just isn't working anymore for many people, and giving permission to students to imagine how we could live differently in the world and be differently in the world. I totally agree that there needs to be a connection between the two. Once it becomes about escaping reality, then it's problematic. So one of the things I find as an educator is how to straddle this dual need to disengage from the world as it is and free the imagination, but somehow cycle around again and reconnect with the mechanisms and organizations and institutions outside of academia to see what can be done. I think an important thing, and Aric just mentioned it there, is that it's not often speculations, I think, get mixed up as blueprints and proposals to be somehow implemented. And I think more they're like stepping stones. If you think of a horizon of imagination, the limits of what we can imagine today, we can't see over that edge. And I think sometimes speculating can provide stepping stones that bring us a little bit closer, and we can start to glimpse kind of as of yet unthought thoughts. And I think that's particularly the case when designers start to interact with other disciplines, whether it's philosophy, anthropology, political science or whatever. And the depth of knowledge in those fields enables us to kind of ourselves move closer to this limit in what can be imagined today. Yeah, so that's the kind of end of my presentation.
Do you want to go to the beginning?
Shall I?
Sure.
Yeah, it's not really a presentation. I guess Nina asked me to talk a little bit about what we're doing at the New School and how we transitioned from the kind of work we were doing at the Royal College of Art in London. So I guess I'll kind of talk a little bit about that from the macro to the micro.
That would be wonderful. Maybe I give a few words again to the audience to kind of pin you down where you are, who you are. So you are one of two of the art group, which also is interesting that you decided on your website to call all the things you do an art group. So that's just as a side story. But so Tony, Anthony, Danny, and Fiona Raby founded the art group Danny and Raby, and you're stimulating and you're creating mediums to discussion and debate amongst designers, industry, and the public about social, cultural, and ethical implications of existing and emerging technologies. You really pinned down the term speculative design. Hence, that's why we moved right into that question with you. And the question New School is imminent because you were for many years in one of the foundations of design education in London, RCA, and then moved to New York to the New School, and where you are now the professor in design and emerging technology. So what's really interesting is to see, it's like the past and what's the New School. Is that a provocation? Is that what you're living and freeing yourself now, being in the New School? What is the New School, or what should be the New School?
Okay. First of all, we're definitely not an art group. I don't know where, if that's on our website, we've been hacked. I think that we've gone to great length over the years to try and make a case of why what we do, although it might appear to be art-like, is a form of design, and trying to push at the edges of design to embrace activities and roles that maybe traditionally would have been in fine art. But yes, Fiona and I are university professors of design and social inquiry at the New School, which means that all our classes are open to the whole university. And we're very interested in connections between design and fiction, from utopias to dystopias, heterotopias, thought experiments, parallel worlds, and as Aric said, even counterfactuals and looking at historical possibilities for fiction. Unfortunately, fiction in design has become conflated these days with futures. And the future, of course, is just one way of making sense of fiction, and in my view, an extraordinarily limited way, because it starts with the present and then extends that somehow into a future. And as there are so many problems and issues with underlying ideas shaping the present, futures seem to just extend those further. So we're very interested in alternative ways of thinking about fictional worlds that can also be useful, not just as a form of entertainment or escapism. At the New School, we collaborate with faculty in many different departments in our teaching. And we're kind of interested in what does it mean to do interdisciplinary imagining? When you have designers and anthropologists in the room together, how do you begin to imagine, and what do those imaginings begin to look like, and how are they different from design? And I'm also interested in what it means to be a designer in academia. What kinds of opportunities are there for us that are different, say, from being a designer in industry or being a designer in a design studio even? And also, what are those limitations? So they're the kind of issues Fiona and I tend to explore. For 10 years, I led the Design Interactions department at the Royal College of Art with a small group of teachers and designers. And we were kind of building out of an interaction design program and looking at how designers could connect with research being done in science and technology in different ways. And I guess one of the main ideas that came out of that was to shift away from thinking about applications for technology to thinking about what their implications are once they're released into everyday life through the marketplace. As many of the technologies didn't exist, they were in laboratories. A lot of the biotech were just tiny little prototypes. The design that we were doing to engage with those researchers also became a little bit fictional and speculative, and maybe even science fictional. And I think as we became more embedded in that kind of way of working, I'd always been very critical of technology, starting in the 90s when we worked in a computer-related design lab, and we were very much against the hype of techno-utopianism. But certainly in the 2000s, it became way more dystopian even than anything we could imagine. And Fiona and I started to realize it wasn't about looking at implications, because this was assuming the starting point was fine. But going back to the starting point and trying to think about the worldview driving technological development. The worldviews are made from values, beliefs, hopes, fears, ideals, and so on, and figuring out how we could work with those kinds of ideas rather than implications. And that, in a way, was our motivation for moving to the New School, where the New School has a design school, Parsons, that also has the New School for Social Research, which has philosophy, anthropology, political science, sociology, and so on, and many other schools. And we wanted, these people have spent far more time thinking about that end of the technological spectrum, the kind of worldview side of things, than we have, and we wanted to engage with that. So what we've been finding is sort of, as designers are disengaging from a solution-orientated mindset, trying to align themselves to the reality that no longer seems to be working, they're adopting and borrowing processes from social sciences that are much more inquiry-driven. And we're finding at the same time the social scientists, who are usually focused on analysis and critique, are using these classes to speculate and draw on their amazing in-depth knowledge to kind of imagine other possibilities. I think that, as I sort of said just a few minutes ago, I think the challenge we're facing is how to create learning environments that sort of allow designers to come together with these other disciplines and build new kinds of worldviews. I mean, there's lots of knowledge on how you develop new technologies, but it's much harder and there's less knowledge available on how you build a worldview, a way of seeing the world, a way of thinking about being in the world. And I think one of the other things that weirdly happened at the New School was being in such intense interaction with political scientists, anthropologists, and theorists, we've come to appreciate some of the basic qualities of design. The fact that design can give form to ideas, ideals, ways of seeing the world, and so on, and try to reconnect with that. So I think we're very interested, as I said a few minutes ago in response to Aric's question, in how a designer can bring those materializing and concretizing skills into dialogue with more academic disciplines to start to concretize other ways of being in the world that are definitely not meant to be blueprints, but stepping stones for trying to reach closer to this horizon of collective imagination. And I think, unfortunately, I wasn't able to look around the show, but I had to look at the Instagram page, which I think is really well structured and makes going through so many projects extremely useful. Easy. And there were two that jumped out. One of them was Micromort, the project that Alex mentioned for very similar reasons, and because I see it as a stepping stone that helps us move forward a little bit in our thinking. And the other was the London Waste Orchestra that I found fascinating, that moved into a project that has been so thoroughly explored, yet managed to find a fairly unique and thought-provoking take on dealing our relationship and how we understand and view waste. It's basically a project that took everyday waste in one part of London and used it to build musical instruments, which were then used by students at the Royal College of Music and to produce new pieces, but also the basis of workshops where people could be brought together to rethink their own relationships to technology.
So with your last example, especially by Andrew, if I remember well, is the student's name, isn't it? It's not only interdisciplinary work between different academias or different professions, but it also goes very much into the collaborative and kind of bringing in the public and involving the public. So that is something that you managed to do also in the new school. It's open to all the departments. Are you actually able to bring in also inscribed students to listen into your lectures, because that would be, the ultimate move somehow to open up even further?
I think, unfortunately, no. I think that with lectures, of course, they can always be public, and they are. But with the intense studio-based or hybrid classes where you're dealing with 10 or 12 students over 15 weeks, that's not really possible. But Fiona and I try to do lots of workshops where we bring that kind of thinking into other environments, whether they're different design schools or different kinds of publics, to also kind of test out these ideas. I think that we focus a lot on design. I mean, we as the design community, but how people understand and interpret design also needs a lot of work, and how we expand the mindset that people bring when they're encountering a piece of work, so they're not just thinking about it as a consumable product, but as a kind of a tool for thinking with. And often these workshops by working with non-designers help to kind of work more, not just writing design, but if you like, how do we read design in new and inspirational ways.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing which maybe I already mentioned in the beginning as well, but the exhibition is not really, you cannot connotate anymore which nationality or which location, geographical position lies behind a project, and which I think is only for the benefit of the entire design world, of course. But this also leads me to the question of collaboration and language in a way, because on one hand you open up the walls of the institution and you try to bring people together, but it's often, if it's interdisciplinary, it's a matter of language, not language, let's say Finnish versus English versus Spanish versus Chinese, etc. But it's more really the way things are customed or the way you perceive things. So you learn a specific language to speak about your own work, which sometimes becomes incomprehensible for another person because you're so in your own bubble. How are you facing these kind of hurdles, or do you see them as hurdles when it comes to interdisciplinary work?
No, that's a really that's a true point. It's a big hurdle, and I think in our classes we have students not only from different disciplines, nationalities, and so on, but some, mainly they're MFA or MA. Some are PhDs and some are seniors doing their bachelors. So none of the default languages work. So luckily the classes run over 15 weeks, and part of the class is learning how to communicate and talk and share ideas with people from other disciplines. And in a way, jettisoning jargon and going straight to how do you talk about ideas and how do you communicate and engage people in as straightforward a language as possible, which sounds a bit obvious, but you'd be surprised at how difficult that can be to do. And I think doing that requires building up a sense of trust. When you bring people who are quite competent and accomplished in say, they're doing a PhD in political science or something, you stick them in a room with a pile of designers and photographers and artists, they suddenly have to expose themselves in ways that can make them feel extremely vulnerable. And I think creating a part of designing the class is creating a sort of an environment where people can feel less vulnerable and trust the others. And that can take weeks, I think, to establish. And not to feel ridiculous, imagining kind of strange and apparently strange scenarios and so on. But I think you're right, language, disciplinary language is definitely a hurdle that has to be managed in some way.
Or the other way around, that's what the next thing is that we need to address, right? Yeah, so it's not anymore an obstacle. I'm still very intrigued to hear Aric's point of view, how an institution can become a source of education and experimentation. I don't want to say research. It almost feels like the word research is a bit like sustainability. It's one of these words that mean everything and nothing somehow. But if we talk about experimentation, how you guys also all mentioned that it's something very hands-on and very daily and practical. How can an institution, like your institute, and I'm not going to say it wrongly again, become a platform for collaboration and interdisciplinary? Now, I know you just became the director, but I'm sure you can maybe give us some hints on the plans and programs that you're thinking up.
Sure. So, I mean, in terms of collaboration, I think there's a very deeply embedded impulse in the Netherlands to collaborate. So I'm sort of not so worried about that. These network. I think the issue about collaboration is that is why are you collaborating, and are you collaborating in a way that sort of makes sense, or are you doing it to sort of fulfill various policy check various policy boxes to get your funding? And I think we need to really think about the ways in which we collaborate along those lines. But when it comes to an institution as a testing ground, in this threshold between, let's say, speculation and practice. Again, I think we have both a sort of opportunity, but also the luxury of being able to do that as a cultural institution, right? We can almost get away with things more than a real organization might be able to, and so. Things like our research team right now is working on the notion of a zoop, and the zoop it's derived for the Greek word zoa for life, and also the word for cooperative. And this is a kind of exercise in more than humanism, in which we try to embed within our organizational decision-making process non-human voices. And so there's a whole structure for how that might happen based on research, but then actually implemented structurally. And this is something that seems like we ought to just try. It doesn't have to be forever. Maybe it's for 6 months, maybe it's for a year, maybe it is forever. But as a cultural institution, this is something that we're almost obligated, I think, to give a shot. I was doing a talk earlier this morning along these lines about kind of new institutional practices, and Joseph Grima from Eindhoven was talking about how by legislation or by regulation the Design Academy has to sort of do things a certain way. Fortunately, we don't have those kinds of constraints. And when it comes to cultural institutions, I find that the constraints are usually self-imposed as a result of a sort of institutional baggage or inertia, or this is the way things have always been done, so that's why we have to do them that way. And I guess being a new institute, being only 8 years old, we don't have that same kind of baggage, and I think this is something that we should really take full advantage of.
Right. I think you nailed it out. I think all of the three of you said things have always been like that, but one should actually think differently, because there's always chance to look at it from diagonal, bottom up, top down, etc. What's going to be your first project? Do you give us a sneak preview?
Or there's some. We have a few things that we're going to be able to announce in a few weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
No sneak preview just yet.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to run by all the three of you. Just one thought is design education. Of course, you choose the school first. Well, first you choose what you want to do, luckily, if you know what you want to do. Then you choose the school, and you hope you to get into the school you want to. At some point, the school becomes, once you graduate, the school is not anymore as important. I mean, nobody will look at your CV and go through maybe the schools that, at least in design, the schools that you come from, because you kind of make your career. So I'm wondering if you feel, for example, shouldn't we maybe rethink this education system, or give again more credit to the teacher? Let's say the classical system in art, you had the master and you had the apprentice, and it was very clearly the way of thinking and the way of working, the techniques and so on, they came directly from the master. to the apprentice. There was no institution, no school necessarily behind it. It was very human and one-on-one. And sometimes it feels, at least the way we speak about education, that the actual teachers who are forming new designers and architects, don't want to say they're forgotten, but let's say it hasn't been anymore so much talked about. They become maybe more important when you go into the masters and, after 50 years have passed by and we speak about our kind of general and iconic masters together. Do you think there's margin and necessity to kind of remember, and this sounds like a rhetorical question now, but to give more space to the teachers who are in the institutions rather than the institutions themselves? Maybe
I think we should give more space to the students. I mean, I think this idea of the masters is, I'm completely surprised this, because I think it's such a dated idea of the master, and it's also so gender loaded. Who are the masters? The white males of the Western world. Excuse me, but we are past that. I'm much more interested in the collaboration in which the distinction between the teacher and the student is much more blurred. I think my experience as a teacher all my life, and I have taught all my life practically, is been that I learn as much from the students as they learn from me. And if they learn anything, it's about collaboration. It's about precisely collaboration with other students. The most important thing that you have to do as a teacher is create that zone of trust, in which students don't become defensive about what they are doing and think they cannot, instead enter in some dialogue with other students, not just in architecture or in design, but in other fields of the university. And the way to do this, in my experience, has been to propose from the beginning these collaborative projects, in which right from the first year of the PhD program, which is the one program that you will say is more individualistic, everybody writing their thesis, everybody paranoid that somebody is copying their ideas. The first year force them to work collaboratively. They learn a lot from each other, and you learn a lot from them. I look forward to every fall, because a new generation is coming in with new preoccupations, with new ways of seeing the world that I wouldn't have access to. How of course, through your children, you learn so much about the world too. Your kid is in kindergarten, and all of a sudden you start, I'm from Spain. I start understanding America with my kid going through preschool and to kindergarten. That's the kinds of things they do here. The show and tell, for example, of the Americans. I never understood that, right? So why are they always so free to speak in public, to present an idea, where the Spaniards, or in general the Europeans, are much more self-conscious and concerned about them? You're in kindergarten and they ask you to bring an object from home and explain what is the significance of this object. So you have a 3-year-old getting up there and talking about it. The first time that my daughter said she had to bring an object to school and give a speech, I thought that's amazing. That's why they have no problem in any situation participating. So less matters, more collaboration between teachers and students. You should actually tone it down. And if it happens that you have been helpful, very good. But you shouldn't take so much the credit, because so many things happen in a classroom, and so many things happen in a university that is not one person ever. It's a village. It takes a lot of. And I'm very, very intrigued by your idea of what I would call interspecies kind of collaboration, which you would think is very much something of today, this fascination that we have with the contributions to our life made by animals, by plants, etc. But think about Ina Bobardi, and I wanted to mention her in this context of a great designer, Italian, Brazilian designer that came from here precisely. And he became such an important figure, but also a fantastic teacher. Nobody so much recognizes her as a teacher. And what I wanted to emphasize precisely is this question of the species collaboration. I'm fascinated how in her work, for example, when she's doing the glass house, her own glass house in Sao Paulo, she makes a whole list with drawings and everything of every creature living on the site, even the insects, all these things. And this is, of course, super important, right? And we have for so long, as architects and as designers, ignored all of this, like we are the masters of the universe, right?
Well, very humbly so, having a master here next to us. But Tony, on your end, if the word master and apprentice doesn't sit well with you, how would you describe your role as a teacher? Would you say it's guidance, it's moderation? Is it teaching? Is it
I think I agree with that, with everything that Beatriz said. I mean, I think it's complicated. I think you're maybe a facilitator and a guide. I mean, I teach mainly at master's and sometimes PhD level, and the students definitely know, they want to go their own way and they have their own direction and so on. So I think you're just guiding them. I think the way I look at it is we're all in it together, trying to figure out, learn stuff, push at the edges of design. But as a teacher, you definitely have probably more experience doing it. But that's probably the only thing that would separate you, and you can bring that to the conversation. But as Beatriz said, I too love the beginning of the academic year, when you wait to see what new ideas, issues, challenges are going to land in your world. And of course, teaching, it's such an amazing insight. It's like you're standing on the edge of a new world, seeing these new ideas and sensibilities emerge right before your eyes, before they even go out into the real world. But just going back to your question, I'd say maybe facilitating and guiding in a kind of gentle way would be the role I would hope to take on. Definitely not a master.
You're all two very humble, and there's Aric. You're definitely a facilitator. You must have a wonderful telephone book of all the matchmaking that you're doing. What do you say?
I was going to call myself a master.
You wouldn't?
No, I'm kidding.
Of the arts. But maybe a last question to all the three, because I think our time is running up already. If you wanted to give a recommendation to the new generation of designers who especially are emerging also in your different faculties, but also in this exhibition. Of course, it's take the things in your hand, don't wait to be invited, rethink the system. What else would you like to recommend them? Aric, shall we start with you?
I guess hang in there. I mean, I think this is, in my encounters with students in different parts of the world, you definitely see a sense of anxiety. I think finishing school or being in school at a time like this, when there is so much uncertainty, can be really difficult. But as Beatriz was saying earlier, I mean, from crisis comes opportunity, right? And just keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm. Beatriz?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, from crisis comes opportunity. From every major crisis that we have had, we have emerged better as a discipline, design and architecture. As I mentioned before, the last time that there was a real revolution in architecture and design pedagogy was precisely in the 60s and 70s, in the middle of major civilian protests, in the middle of a great revolution. So this is a very important moment. I think I see in the exhibition great interest on the part of the students and great capacity to reimagine the world and not waiting for anybody. In fact, it's fascinating that many of the things they are proposing don't exist in the world of industry, and whether they work or not, I don't know. But some of them have managed even to make some collaboration with some industry and make the product actually quite, and others are more speculative, right? But I think speculation is also real. It's absolutely necessary. So I think the time of education is the time of speculation, and don't forget that you are learning as much from your teachers than you are learning from all the other creatures around you, the other students and the other species.
And the teachers are learning from you. Tony, what would you say? It's reimagine and...
I think hang on to your ideals. I think it's a very, very, very difficult thing to do, especially in the world we're living in right now. But I would say, if at all possible, that would be the thing to try and hold on to. And I think one way of doing that is to try and either create or participate or find communities that help you strengthen your own position in these very tumultuous times. And of course, everything that Aric and Beatriz said, but that would be my suggestion.
Wonderful. I think it's lovely that we're finishing on such a high note and a positive note. My invitation would only go to the design industry as well, to give a little bit more space, trust, time to utopian ideas who actually might become reality and very practical if we just believe in them a little bit longer. So a huge thank you to all the three of you, Tony, Beatriz, and Aric. It was a pleasure to have you all three almost physically. It's such a unique opportunity to have three wonderful mastery minds on one platform, and I hope everyone enjoyed it, also out in the screens, and enjoy the rest of the Supersalone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.